Life is complicated, or at least that's how it feels. We fill our days, stretch our limits, chase more, carry more, and then wonder why we end up burned out, stretched thin, and just trying to keep up. But what if the problem isn't life? What if we've just complicated what was never meant to be? This is It's Complicated, a series about cutting through the noise, getting back to what matters most, and rediscovering the simplicity of a life grounded in faith, family, and purpose. Each episode, I'll take one area of life that feels tangled, expose the lie that's keeping it that way, and bring it back to truth. Because clarity brings peace. And maybe, just maybe, it doesn't have to be complicated. Let's get into it. Well, g'day, and welcome. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to my studio this afternoon. It's not as nice outside as it was earlier today. I was sitting in the car on the phone for quite some time this morning, and the sun was just glorious. But then I opened the door and realized that the wind was frigid. So beautiful autumn pre-winter weather. Make the most of it. It's field days season here in the Waikato. So if you're not from this region, that's when tens of thousands of people flood into our neighbourhood for the annual field days event, which is a key part of the economy. And also because it's a key part of the economy, it's also a key marker, I suppose you could say, as to the health of the economy. If the economy is tanking, the agricultural and farming industry do not spend money. But when it's going well, it seems to flow. Money flows. And the flow of money is a sign of health in the economy, whether it's the national economy or your personal economy. I suppose if your economy is not healthy, your finances aren't flowing. But here we are. Podcast time, coffee with Phil, and I'm excited to be coming to the end, I suppose. Well, I'm not excited. I'm excited about the series we've been doing. It's complicated, and I suppose we're coming to the end of it because it's time to move on. But this is Coffee with Phil, episode 168. The title of this episode and the focus of this episode is Faithful Friends, and I want to take a bit of a swing at this today, and I hope it's encouraging for you. I know preparing for it has been encouraging for me. But what's the genesis of the series is the simple thought that we tend to make life complicated, and as we complicate it beyond what God, I believe, what God had intended for us, we tend to mess things up. And I feel like the whole purpose of this series, and if you haven't listened to all of them, go back and make sure you grab them, get the key points from the show notes, make sure you get the reference points, which are often found on my website, philstrong.com. But really, look, the whole point here, I really feel like God is saying, come back to the simplicity of the way of following Jesus. I spoke about this in my book, Limbo Land. There's a chapter in there about following Jesus. And the model or the analogy, the allegory that I had in that chapter was following the footsteps of Jesus and staying so close in the sandstorm that you could see his most recent footprint and put your foot in it. That's the simplicity I'm talking about, just following Jesus step by step, staying close, step by step, close enough to hear his voice, close enough to see his footprint, and keeping life simple. Now, those of you that know me well, including the dear one that lives with me, will undoubtedly know that I am the worst at keeping my life simple. I am an expert at making my life complicated. And even just recently, I was having lunch with family, and we joked about the extremity and the diversity between those of us on my side of the table and those of us on the other side of the table, because I said, look, there's chaos over here, and there's just simple order and systematic planning on your side of the table. I said, but please do not leave the table, because I need people like you around me. I need people like you to speak into my life. I need people like you to help me stay grounded, because I know I'm my own worst enemy. So friends, this series is for me, and you're welcome to join along. I hope it is adding some value to your life of faith, your walk with Jesus, and that you would, as I always hope, as for me, but also what I hope for you, my prayer for you is that your faith would be real. It wouldn't just be a conversation we have for 30 minutes in a podcast, or listening to a 25-minute sermon on a Sunday and ticking the box. Maybe you read the word for the day for 15 minutes. Guys, that is not enough to make your faith real in your life. I don't just want to have a conversation. I want to integrate faith into every aspect of my life. And that's what I've enjoyed about this series. We've talked about family, we've talked about focus, we've talked about finances, we have talked about faith, fulfillment, and last week we talked about the future you. Well, this week we're talking about faithful friends. And the keen observant ones of you, the three of you that are observant, will notice that all of the titles start with F. Had you worked that out yet? I'm not sure you had. Anyway, faithful friends. What am I saying today? We make life complicated. And when you do life with other people, I have to tell you, if you haven't worked this out already, doing life with other people makes life complicated. Just one extra person in your life makes it more complicated. Then you add little people, and that makes life very complicated. And those little people, if you feed them, grow up to be big people. And life does not get more simple. It changes, and it becomes more enriching and more beautiful every day, but it's still complicated. We can influence that in some ways. And I want to kind of get to that today, but we can be influenced. And this is really the point. We can be influenced by those around us, and the complication in our life can be somewhat added to. So what is it that we should look for in a world that we live in that is pressuring us to make things complicated, where the pace of life is fast, where the demand on our finances and the demand on our time and the demand even on our family is increasing ever more, and we're enabling it. So how do we find a safe place? How do we find the kind of framework, as it were, to help life to not be overcomplicated to the point where it strangles us? And the answer to that today is faithful friends. So what I want to do in the next little bit of time that I have with you is I want to talk to you about David from the Bible. David the shepherd who became a warrior, the warrior who wrote psalms of simplicity and devotion towards God, the shepherd, the singing shepherd warrior who became a king. Man after God's own heart. Is the way that God described him through the prophet Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 15. But what I want to do today is take a different look. And so I want you to lean in, and we're going to tell some stories, and we're going to do some reflection. But here's the thing. If you know the story of David, it was complicated, man. I've done a lot of research on the life of David for a book that I'm writing. And in it is my view that David was born to a different woman than his brothers. It's complicated, I don't want to get into it, but he was called a bastard by his brothers. And that would lead me, with other evidence, to conclude that whether it was a second wife, a concubine, or some other means by which David was conceived, his brothers despised him for it. His life was complicated. He was raised as the runt of the litter, the rejected son. When Samuel the prophet came to the house, his father Jesse didn't even invite David to the circle. He was somewhat embarrassed of him. As Samuel, the Lord himself, through the prophet Samuel, then made that life a little more challenging, but I don't mean that disrespectfully or in some way to dishonor the Lord, but it became complicated because he was anointed as the future king of Israel as a young boy while King Saul was still on the throne. And that's hella awkward right there. But these things, and there's so much more we're going to look into, these things are what made the narrative of David's life flow in synchronicity with God's heart. Now, what I mean by that is cadence, friends. You know, if you've got in the old days, when I was a young fella and I was learning the piano, my piano teacher, lovely old lady, I can't remember her name, but I can see her face. She was about 107 years old, I'm sure of it. And I'm sitting there as an 11-year-old. Well, that was my perspective, was that she was 107. And she had this TikTok thing on. No, well, that's the wrong phrase to use with you young people, isn't it? It wasn't a TikTok as you think about it. It was a metronome. It was tick-tock, click, clack, click, clack. And you set the weight on it to determine the cadence or the time. And you played the music in line with the click, clack, click, clack, click, clack, click, clack. And if it was a faster song, we'd go click, clack, click, clack, click, clack, click, clack. Or really slow, click, clack, click, clack. And I'm purposely not using TikTok so I don't confuse you. But a metronome set the cadence, it set in the pace of the way the music was to be played. Now, what I'm saying to you is all these events in David's life say to me that we can't necessarily uncomplicate our lives every time, because God makes it complicated. He makes a promise. He sets up a faith step. He asks us to make a choice. We choose the narrow path, not the wide and easy path. But all of these things, friends, I'm trying to encourage myself here. Or help me out. Be encouraged. I'm trying to encourage me. All of these things made the narrative of his life flow in cadence and in alignment with the rhythm of God's heart. So that's the click, click, clack. And because of that, because he knew God was near, because he knew God was taking steps in front of him, and all he had to do was take that one step after the other to follow in the path that God had laid out for him, because he knew that, David's heart aligned with God's, and David's heart was after God's, and so David responded well. But there's a key that I want us to see that helped David to respond well. And that key, my friends, is found in the title of this podcast episode, and that title is Faithful Friends. So what I want to do today is I want to look around David, and I want to look at it from the perspective of the faithful friends, and I want to point you to three guys, one whom you'll know, the others is not that common, but we'll read about them, and I want you to consider this from two perspectives. So let's get into that, because I don't want to run out of time. So the first one is a guy you're going to know about, and his name is Jonathan. Jonathan is the son of King Saul. And if you remember, we know that Jonathan was a friend of David. So David is invited into the house of King Saul because Saul's having troubles. And David is a musician. He plays the lute, the harp, and sings, and when he sings, the peace of God enters the room, opposing the chaos that's around Saul, and Saul's troubles are alleviated. Now, because David is living in the palace, he becomes friends with Jonathan. I'm guessing they were of a similar age. It says in 1 Samuel 18, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Now, that would say to me that they were quite close. In verse 3 of 1 Samuel 18, it says, Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. The point there is that they made this pact. They made this friendship. They were committed to each other. You see, you've got to understand, in the days of the Hebrews, a covenant was made where you would put not just your reputation on the line, but your life. I will honor you in this pledge, even if it costs me everything. And should I fail in this pledge, this is what the Hebrews would think. If I fail in this pledge, I will give my life as a price for my failure. That's the power of a covenant, and that's the kind of friendship that Jonathan wanted to convey to David, and I believe it was mutual if you read the story. The point is, we're looking at this through Jonathan's eyes. He saw something of the essence and the heart of God in David, in the way David conducted himself, in the way he sang, in the way he ministered with music, in the way he brought peace into an atmosphere of chaos. Jonathan was Saul's son, and I bet he bore the wrath the anger, the confusion, and the tyranny of his oppression from time to time, as the son knows. David alleviated that. David brought peace to the household. In 1 Samuel chapter 20 and verse 16, David and Jonathan are having this conversation, and he says, "Before the Lord God to be my witness." And then in verse 16, Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David. And Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. Friends, I'm trying to reiterate just how these two friends saw each other. David is cast out of the house of Saul. He has to run for his life because Saul has made a vow that he will kill David. David hides in the caves at Adullam, and Jonathan sends messages to him. Saul pursues him. But in all of this, Jonathan hides David. And they meet together in chapter 23 and verse, where is it, in verse 15 and then 16. Jonathan went to David at Horesh and strengthened him in God. And he said to him, "Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you." He was honoring that covenant that he made. He was honoring that pledge that he made. He said, "You have become to me more than my father." He's saying, "I see what God has ordained in your life. You shall be the king. You shall be the king over Israel." It says it here in verse 17. "You shall be the king over Israel, and I shall be next to you." My father knows this. And it says in verse 18, the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. Their bond together was ratified. It was cemented. It was forged in the presence of the Spirit of God. And I want you to understand that this is how much Jonathan loved his friend. He was willing to make a covenant with him. Now, the second guy, oh my gosh, I've got to move fast. The second guy that I want us to have a look at is actually in 2 Samuel. And I was reading this just in the past week. In 2 Samuel 15, so David is now king, and he's been doing all sorts of cool things. But in a time, this is horrible, in a time where his son Absalom decides to raise up the nation against his father, who's the king over all Israel. And Absalom starts spreading rumors, he starts telling lies, he starts being a political adversary to David and trying to get the heart of the people to follow him. And David, this is the weak part of David in this moment. He doesn't actually rise up against it. He doesn't want to bring harm to his son, which was deemed to be a failure on his part. And I don't want to focus on that right now because we're looking at this through the eyes of the people around David. And so David says, "Hey, look, we're going to leave Jerusalem because if we stay here, Absalom will kill us because he has the people with him." And he says to his friends and his followers, "Let's go. Let's flee because we must go. Come, let us exit the house." And so all his servants pass him by. So this is 2 Samuel 15. And the Cherethites and the Pelethites and all the 600 Gittites who had followed him from Gath passed before the king. So in a previous season of David's life, when he was hiding from Saul, he had gathered these faithful men. They had fought beside him because he had defended their honor, he had preserved them, and he had given them identity, and he had given them purpose. And these 600 men were known as his mighty men, the warriors. Okay, there's a whole different story about the 3 and the 300 and the 600. But anyway, the 600 go past. Listen to this. And then these guys pass before them. Then it says, the king said to Ittai the Gittite. This is our second friend. I want you to understand. Ittai the Gittite. And the king says to him, "Why do you also go with us? Go back and stay with the king," meaning Absalom, who was going to steal the throne. "For you are a foreigner and also an exile from your home," meaning you're not an Israelite. You're not of the house of Judah. You're not at risk of losing your life because of this conspiracy. Choose the easy path. Man, I just love what Ittai says. Listen. In verse 21, Ittai answered the king, "As the Lord lives," meaning Yahweh, "as Yahweh lives, and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king shall be, whether for death or for life, there also will your servant be." David said to him, "Go, pass on," and he passed with his men. The point is, this guy Ittai, he chose David because David had chosen him. He wasn't swayed even by David. He wasn't swayed by the political environment. He decided he was a faithful friend and he was a servant regardless of the outcomes. Now, there's a reason why I'm showing you these three guys, and we're going to wrap it all together because I've got some challenges for us all. So the first guy we looked at was Jonathan. We set the scene for David because he had a friend who made a covenant with him. Then we see this man Ittai, faithful warrior. He's probably got blood under his fingernails, but he's followed David into battle, and he's seen David defend his people and defend the honor of the name of Yahweh. Take the point that this man is a Gittite. He is not born in the Hebrew nation, but he's willing to serve Yahweh. He's willing to serve the king that Yahweh has appointed. Fascinating to me. It's fascinating. And then I was just reading down the page, and I came to this one line, and this is the third guy that I want to share with you. So David was leaving Jerusalem. He comes down out of the city of Jerusalem, down the hill. He goes through the bottom of the valley, across the creek bed, and he goes up the Mount of Olives that face the other side. And he's wandering up to the summit where God was worshipped. And behold, Hushai the Archite came to meet him with his coat torn and dirt on his head. So he's in mourning, he's in grief, he's demonstrating his absolute disdain for what's happening. And he comes to David, and David says to him, "If you go with me, you will be a burden to me because of this state you're in. But if you return to the city, and if you say to Absalom, 'I will be your servant, O king, as I have been your father's servant. Now I will be your servant.'" And David basically sets him up to be a spy. He says to go in there and then to report what the priests are saying, what the king is saying. Send these messages to me through their sons. Send to me everything you hear. And then this is it. Listen. So Hushai, David's friend, came into the city just as Absalom came into Jerusalem. Now, did you hear that? Hushai, David's friend. And I had to find a cross-reference for this because I was like, well, hang on, how do we get to this point? And so across where we've got the Chronicles, in 1 Chronicles 27, this guy is also mentioned right near the end here. It talks about David's council and who was leading him, and it says, "And Hushai the Archite was the king's friend." What a fantastic badge to be wearing as a character in the scriptures. Here you are, Hushai. What's your name? Hushai. Well, who are you? I'm a friend of David, and David calls me his friend. It was recorded in the Chronicles of the King that Hushai was his friend. Marvelous. And what would he have had to do to earn that right? I can only wonder. And look, I'm not going to get into it now, but if you go and then follow on from that and you understand what Hushai did to demonstrate his friendship, absolutely life-changing to understand that. But I want to move on because I want to now make, look at the clock, I want to make 3 observations and I want to finish with 2 questions. So let's bring this home. Faith made real means not just reading the text, but having the text read you. It means integrating the Word of God into your life by the Spirit of God so that you can be transformed. Friends, that's what the Bible does. And the purpose of this podcast is just point you to the Scriptures and to let the Holy Spirit do His work in you because God sees the work He wants to do. Let me make these observations. Let me give them to you A, B, C. Let's go. Let's talk about it. What I want to do is I want you to think of Jonathan. So go back to the way that I spoke about Jonathan. Let me say this to you. Faithful friends focus on what did God say and not how am I feeling or how does this affect me? Think about that. Jonathan was the son of King Saul. And in those days, the king was appointed, had all the wealth and the authority. He was the ruling body that received all the taxes. And what was really, really normal in those days was the son would succeed him, the son of the house. So Jonathan was next in line for the throne. But Jonathan was sensitive enough to know what God had said. He either learned or discerned, and we don't know necessarily how he learned this, but we do know he did confess, "You shall be king. God has appointed you to be king." So faithful friends focus on what God has said. What did God say? And I will align with that. Can you see the difference? You see, some people in our lives, they don't focus on what God's doing or saying. They're like, "I don't feel good. You're making me feel insecure. You're making me feel stupid. You're making me feel unsafe. You're making me feel like unvalued. You're making me feel like you're ripping me off or you're discarding me." They focus on feelings and they focus on how it affects them. Think about Jonathan. He had right to say, "I hate you, David, because you cost me my throne." But he didn't say that, did he? He's a faithful friend, and I just want to honor Jonathan for the heart that he had for David, how he said, "I will align myself with what God has said." And I can tell you, friends, me having people like that around me is worth more than gold. It's absolutely critical for me. I love having friends that come back time and time again with me and help me to come back to, what did God say? What do we know God said? And let's align our hearts with what God has said. Every single one of us should be doing that, and we should be doing it for others. That's the point. All right. That was my first observation. The second observation that I want to make here: faithful friends focus on long-term covenant that cannot be swayed or argued. Now, remember, a covenant is a pledge. I commit myself in this pledge to you, and I will give my life for that regardless of the cost, regardless of the pain, regardless of the discomfort or the inconvenience, and I will honor it to the point with which I would give my life. Now, literally in Hebrew days, they would say, "Cut me in half." Now, you and I might not say that today, but where's the commitment to covenant, eh? Now, faithful friends focus on long term, and think about Ittai. He had made a pledge to David because David had made a pledge to him. Back in the days when David was hiding from King Saul and they're up in the land of the Philistines, and he goes to the city of Gath and he's got all this crazy stuff going on, and he gathers these outcasts to him. It's literally what David's men were referred to as, social outcasts who had no home. And David gathers them in the caves. He gathers them as he goes, and he says, "If you will be faithful to me, I will be faithful to you. And to prove it, I'm going to be faithful to you, and I expect that you'll learn to be faithful to me." And we see this in the life of Ittai. He made a covenant to the point where he says, "Wherever you go, whether it be life or whether it be death, I will be with you." And even when David tried to argue him out of that and say, "Look, stay. It'll be easy. Be comfortable. You can serve here. You have no hereditary rights to be with me. You have no hereditary risk to stay with Absalom." And Ittai said, "No way, bro. It's you and me all the way." And I love that. Faithful friends focus on long-term covenant that cannot be swayed or argued. The third and final observation I want to make is this. Lean in and listen to this one. Faithful friends are focused on commitment to you, even if it means living in an uncomfortable space or doing things that appear to be unsafe. A faithful friend will take a risk. They'll take a risk on you, but they'll also take a risk for you. They will make themselves vulnerable. They will make themselves exposed. They will disregard public opinion or reputation because they will stand by you as a faithful friend. I want you to think about Hushai. Hushai. We just read about Hushai. Do you love saying that? Hushai. We just read about Hushai. He was a friend of the king. He had stuff going on. He'd torn his coat. He'd dirt on his head. He'd been through all sorts of trouble. And I was to suggest to you that it was family trouble. Lost his family. And David said to him, look, if you come with me, you're going to be a burden. You're just no good to me. But why don't you stay here? It's going to be uncomfortable. I want you to be in the court of Absalom. I want you to serve in his court and say that you're faithful to him. I want you to keep an ear to the ground. I want to hear everything. And I want you to report that at the risk of your life. I want you to report it to the priests. And I want the priests to tell it to their sons. And I want their sons to get messengers to me so that I know what's happening in the palace. And Hushai said, I will do that. My commitment to you as your friend is that I will put myself in a place of discomfort and risk and inconvenience because your life matters to me. What a faithful friend he was. Man, I love that, guys. I love that. And so what I want to do is I really just wanted to point you, not as much to David, but to his friends, because today's episode is about faithful friends. I wanted to point you to Jonathan, who many of us know well. Faithful friend who loved David more than his own soul. But I wanted to point you to Ittai, because I wanted you to learn about his commitment. And I wanted to put you to Hushai because I want you to learn about his friendship. Now, why did I want to point you to those three guys? Listen to this. Here is where we land this. Here is where we answer the question. So what does this mean for me? I want you to consider two perspectives. I want you to consider, firstly, number one, who do I see around me? Who are my faithful friends? Who are the ones that focus on what God said? Who are the ones that live with a long-term covenant? Who are the ones that will serve me regardless of discomfort? Who do I see? And the second question I want to ask you is this. Who can I be? Which kind of friend can I be to those that are close to me? How can I be the friend that leans in and says with one another, what did God say? How can I be the friend who has a long-term commitment and covenant that can't be swayed or argued? And how can I be that faithful friend that focuses on commitment regardless of what it feels like? Who can I be? So 2 things for you to ask this week. What do I see? Who do I see? And who can I be? And I pray that God's grace would be upon you so that you could be a faithful friend, that you could help someone else in the middle of their complicated life to make it less complicated, to keep step with God, to keep that cadence and rhythm of God's heart first and foremost, and that together you would thrive and flourish in faith, and God would shine through you. Man, what would our world be like if we all did that with each other? Come on, let's do it. Let's be community. Let's be family. Let's be God's children. God bless you, my friends. Make sure you have a good coffee with someone this week because life is way too short for bad coffee. God bless you. I look forward to being back with you real soon.